Kristina Werner here. Welcome to another mail art video for SimonsStamp.com. This month I'm going to be creating an envelope using the stamp set Even More Spring Flowers from Simon, and I'm going to be stamping those images onto some Strathmore Bristol paper, and I've cut it down to be slightly larger than the envelope that I'm eventually going to put it on. So I'm going to pencil the size of the envelope onto my Bristol paper, just so I have an idea while I'm stamping and I can get the sizing and placement just right. I'm also taking my postage stamps and placing them in the top corner and outlining them with a pencil so that I have an idea of where those postage stamps will eventually end up on the final envelope. So my design or my idea behind this envelope is I want to have lots and lots of flowers and leaves coming from behind a large banner, and on the banner will be the recipient's address or mailing address. So I'm starting out by drawing the banner. Now this is a really simple banner shape. It starts out with a kind of a rectangle that's a little bit curved. Then you draw a triangle near the top and then two lines coming out, which are the top and bottom of the banner. Connect those with kind of like a really wide V shape, and there you have one half of the banner. To do the other side, you'll do the exact same thing, but just reflected. So a small triangle at the top, and then the top and bottom of the banner, and connecting them with a very wide V. Now, because I want this area to be masked while I do my stamping, I'm going to have to outline this banner in a black pen. This is a black envelope addressing pen from Pilot, and this is going to allow me to have dark enough lines so that I can trace this banner onto some masking paper. So now I have some masking paper from Simon Says Stamp, and it's just thin enough that you can see the banner through the masking paper. It's a little bit hard to see on camera, but it was even more visible in person. It was just dark enough, those black lines, that I could see through and trace it with a pencil. So this mask is going to be a large portion of the design, and I want to make sure that it's the exact size. Now, if you wanted to go about this in kind of the opposite direction, you definitely could. You could draw the banner on the masking paper first, then trim it out, and then before you take it off the envelope or off the cardstock at the very end after you've stamped, you could trace around the masked area and draw the banner in. I think the way I did it is probably a little bit easier because you can get the sizing just perfectly for the finished piece. So I trimmed out that banner and I placed it on top, and now I'm taking the couple of stamps from that stamp set, and I'm going to stamp these in VersaFine ONYX black ink. This ink in particular is waterproof, and it also gives a really solid black line. I didn't even have to stamp these multiple times, even though the area of the stamps was quite large. I got a great impression the first time around. So before I remove those stamps from my MISTI stamp positioning tool, I've placed two pieces of masking paper, and I'm using the residual ink left on the stamps to get some masks for these flowers. It's very faint, but it's just enough that I can cut out the shapes, and then I'll be placing them over the top of those stamped flowers to protect them while I stamp additional images around them. So I'm placing those directly over the top, and then I'm placing some flowers and some leaves around those areas. I'll be using the same exact ink that I've been using for the rest of my design here. So I'll ink that up with some VersaFine ONYX black and then stamp that down. So I ended up moving one of the masks to the same flower that I stamped again, and that allowed me to again stamp some shapes kind of in between. You're going to see I'm just going to fill in those little areas with some additional stamps. I really loved how this turned out, and I think if I would have been thinking ahead, I would have cut two pieces of Strathmore Bristol paper and created two envelopes, just because it was a little bit time consuming with these masks and having to stamp everything. But if I was to do two of them at the same time, it would save me a lot of time. So I removed those masks, and I also placed the masks on the back of my stamp set. These can be reused over and over again. So if I ever want to do a project that's similar to this with masking, I could definitely reuse those masks. In fact, I'm going to save the banner mask as well so that I can create another envelope. So after all that masking and stamping was done, I went around and I erased my pencil lines just so that as I do my watercoloring, I don't trap the pencil lines underneath the watercolor. I'm going to be using one marker from my Zig Clean Color Real Brush marker set. This is the black color. And I'm going to be painting these flowers and leaves all in just this black color. I want it to be very dramatic and really let the colors of those postage stamps with those colorful flowers stand out. So I started out by painting those two shapes, those two little areas on that larger flower right there. I started using a water brush, but then I realized that too much water was coming out and I wanted a little bit more control. So I moved to a regular watercolor brush. This is, I believe it's a size for a watercolor brush from Royal and Langnickel. And I just got it wet, dabbed it off on a paper towel, and then came in to spread out that color. So this was actually pretty time consuming, but also completely worth it in the end. I really love how this turned out. I love the black and white aspect of it. So for this first flower, I wanted it to be fairly medium toned. But as I move on to the flower to the left, I'll start here on it in just a minute, I wanted to keep the area of the flower petals a little bit more light. I wanted it to kind of give the impression that these flowers are different colors, that the one on the left is a lighter shade of whatever color it is. I wanted it to be just a little bit different. So you'll notice that I'm not spreading out the color quite as much. I'm leaving the shadows just right at the line. I don't want the center area of the flowers to get too dark. So if you're doing this with Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers, I really recommend that you use the same cardstock and paper that I'm using today, which, as I mentioned before, is the Strathmore Bristol Smooth. I find that even though these are a watercolor marker, that the color doesn't move as smoothly and as freely unless I use this particular cardstock. I've used these markers on regular watercolor paper in the past, and while you can get the color to move a little bit, it's just a completely different experience when you're using Strathmore Bristol Smooth cardstock. The colors just seem to melt away once you add water, and you can get some really great transitions between colors, or in my case, just the one color today. So I added some shadows and shading on my banner, making sure I add a lot of shadow on those two ends so it looks like it's away from that center area. And at this point, I'm just about done with all of the painting. Just finished off those center areas. I let this piece dry completely, and then I came in with a pencil and I penciled in the recipient's address and name. So this is actually going to Heidi Crowell, who is the founder and owner of Simon Says Stamp, and this is the business address. This is the address for the Simon office. So I'm going to put a little card inside this envelope once it's done and mail it off to the Simon headquarters. I'm using that same black pen that I used earlier to draw the banner. So this is the Pilot Envelope Addressing Pen. This pen in particular is waterproof, and it's a really fine line. This is actually the extra fine version. There are some thicker versions of this pen as well. So I'm going over all of that address. And then I'm actually going to go back to her name, and I'm going to thicken up those lines just a little bit. After I erased all the pencil, I decided that I wanted her name to stand out even just a little bit more than it was. So I thickened up those lines and made it stand out more. So now that I have that finished, I've removed it from the board, and I'm taking that black envelope and I'm going to trace the size of that envelope again, just so I know exactly where to trim this down. If you wanted to leave that line and not erase it before you do your watercoloring, you definitely could. But I didn't know exactly where this was headed at that time, and I thought it best to erase those lines. So now we have the exact size of my black envelope, and I'm going to take some Tombow Extreme adhesive and put that on the back of the watercolor piece, making sure that that adhesive is right up against the edge, because I don't want this watercolor piece to lift up from the surface of the envelope. So now I'm going back to those postage stamps. I'm going to place those on the envelope in the top corner. And these postage stamps are really kind of pretty. They have one continuous design. So I've stuck them on there side by side. Then took the black pen and went around the outer edge with some stitch lines or some dash lines. I thought it would go well with the design of the flowers. To add my address on the back of the envelope, I used a white Jelly Roll pen. This is the number 10 bold weight or width. And I just put my address along the very bottom of that flap on the envelope. To finish off my envelope, I'm going to protect it using some Distress Microglaze, and I'm going to just take some out of the jar and then spread it out onto my design. So if you've been following this mail art series at simonsystamp.com, at their blog, or at my blog, you may have noticed I stopped using the microglaze for a while because I didn't really feel it was as necessary. But some of you were asking what you could do if you wanted to protect your envelope design when it goes through the mail. And this is what I would recommend to protect your envelopes. This is some microglaze, and you just kind of spread it on using your fingertips, and then you buff it into the paper and buff away the excess using a paper towel. And that's all you really have to do. You just have to remember to not put any of that glaze over your postage stamps, because the post office will need to cancel those stamps. And always make sure it's the very last thing you do, because it's really hard to do anything on top of something that already has microglaze on it. Thanks so much for watching this month's mail art video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will see you very soon for another envelope. Thanks for watching.